Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about Stihl's Hexa profile. It was filed in October 2018 and the patent was granted in October 2019. And if you have a look up here, I'll put that up for your benefit. You may want to look that up. That's the information, the patent number, etc. So this coming October, Hexa's been out for 5 years. Now, you don't go around putting a patent on a chainsaw tooth geometry unless it does what you say it does. So typically, full chisel cuts about 10% faster than semi-chisel, and Hexa cuts about another 10% faster than full chisel. So Hexa is about 20% faster than semi-chisel. And I've done tests with the saw and I found out that to be the case. So what I'm doing in this video is to turn around and say, okay, I'm aware of that fact. It's been published. There's a worldwide patent, but a lot of people aren't convinced. I don't know why, but I've done my own tests, and I'm here to say that I agree that with what Stihl say, as far as 10% faster than full chisel. But the question is, why does Hexa cut better? That's the thing. Why does it cut better? Now, over in this corner here, you'll see a digital caliper mounted on this chain vise, and we put a chain in here. So I can measure the height of a tooth. And amongst other things, I can measure the gullet depth. So I measured the height of the Stihl Hexa and I measured the height of the Stihl RS chain, and I found them to be the same. I also used the digital angle gauge to look at the top plate, because the top plate goes back on an angle like that, and they're both 12 degrees, got a slope of 12 degrees, so they're the same. So then I thought, well, okay, let's have a look at the gullet depth. Now, the gullet depth on Hexa was 4.5 millimeters. This is on a brand new chain. From the tip of the point to the bottom of the gullet, 4.5 millimeters. On the RS chain, it was 5 millimeters. So the actual RS has slightly got a little bit more, but that could be just, the manufacturing process. So it's a little bit deeper to the gullet. And that can change it even during filing on round ground chain, because people sometimes make too much of a mistake and file too deep into the gullet. But it brings me back to the next question when we talk about why does it cut better. And we'll get into that in a minute. But first I'll talk about, if you look at a knife, and if you're to look at a chainsaw tooth, we talk about how it's got the C shape here. Well, no cutting instrument that I'm aware of has any C shape. The only instrument that ever has a C shape is a serrated edge knife, and it's used for cutting bread and a few other things. So typically, if anything, a knife has a curve on it, not an inward curve, an outward curve. And that's the way that a knife works. And what they've done with Hexa is put that large straight edge on it. So that's that large straight edge there. Now, the other thing that I found, because I was doing quite a bit of research into this, and if we have a look up in the top left-hand corner, this is taken from the patent. And if you look at the side plate, you'll notice that the top plate cutting angle coming down goes all the way to the side plate, right to, you can see how it is. But in actual fact, if you were to look at a Stihl Hexa chain, it doesn't go all the way down to the side plate. So a little bit of a little bit of a mistake in there. I don't know whether it's production. Now, even when I ground my own hexas, and we'll zoom in there so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So if we bring the tooth down and we have a good look, you'll notice that it almost comes down to the side plate, about 70%. But on the actual drawing, it comes right to the very bottom here. So look, it may be just a production thing, but I've got more than one hexa chain, and they all look like this. They don't come right down to the edge of the side plate. There's the edge of the side plate. It's not far off it, but that's just a little small thing that I found. And as I said, this is 12 degrees slope on this plate here. And the height before, from here to here, is 4.5 millimeters. So, and it was actually, what do we got? Yeah, 4.5 millimeters to the bottom of the gullet. And on the Stihl RS, it was 5 millimeters, slightly deeper. Now, Stihl claim, if you look in their literature about hexa, they turn around and say that it cuts better because there's less friction. So how is there less friction between a hexa? What's different about the tooth? I've just mentioned that the slope here is the same. The tooth height is almost the same. So it's still got plenty of chip clearance. What else is different? Well, as I said before, no cutting instrument, even a chisel of any type, even a knife, doesn't have a curve on the cutting section, the part that actually cuts into the wood. Even if you look at an axe has a curve, but not an inwards curve, an outwards curve. That's too hard to achieve on a chainsaw chain. So the best you can come up with is not have an inward curve, is to have a flat section, which is what hexa's got. The next thing to reduce a bit of friction is to reduce the width of the tooth. And that means the curve. So between the left tooth and the right tooth, if we measure the outside of the left tooth and the outside of the right tooth, you will find that you've got a reduced curve. And also the actual tooth width is reduced. So if we were to look at the actual tooth width, the distance at the widest point, which is here, is 4 millimeters. And you'll notice, if you can barely see, there's the drive link there. And you'll notice that the edge of the tooth goes right over to the drive link, and in the opposite tooth it's exactly the same. You can see even that the front of the tooth goes past the drive link and the back of the tooth just... So the teeth cross over with each other. You've got overlap. So with this tooth being about 4.1 millimeters, the RS chain is 4.5. So therefore, what's going to happen is that you've got a little bit less cutting, but it's a little bit more efficient. With the combination of the tooth being smaller, a narrower kerf overall, and this 60-degree angle. Now, that's another little mistake that I found in Stihl's Hexa, is this angle here in the Stihl USG chart guide. They're listing that as 65 degrees. On a Stihl USG, it's listed as 25 degrees. 25 degrees and 65 degrees is exactly the same thing. The only difference being is your point of reference. Oregon used 90 degrees for vertical reference point, and Stihl used 0 degrees as vertical reference point. So if you tilt from 90 degrees to 65, you've moved 25 degrees. On a Stihl USG, if you start from 0 and move to 25 degrees, that's exactly what you've moved, 25 degrees. But I think they made a mistake, because if you go over to the far right-hand corner, on the Stihl USG grinder where the top plate, where the side plate is, it's listed as 60-degree side plate angle. And when I've checked, I'm finding that this is more close to 60 degrees than 65 degrees. So I think they've made a mistake. I'm pretty sure that they have there, and it wouldn't be the first time that any company's made a mistake. So with all that information, the reason that Stihl cuts, the Stihl Hexa cuts better than the RS, it's just the geometry is more suited to cutting more efficiently. Just a slight reduction in the kerf and a reduction in the width of the tooth also. You can change your kerf without reducing the tooth width by just moving the teeth outwards, but you need to make sure that you still got overlap. So there is a reduction in the total width of the kerf, so there's less energy required. And with that reduction of the tooth width, then you might say, why don't they make all tooth slightly narrower kerf? Well, that's interesting. That's another subject. But I think it's the combination of the narrow kerf and this long top plate cutting angle that comes down the side plate. Normally on your... Now, the other thing that's also very, very interesting, and I'll just put that up there, is that if you were to look at the RS chain, and that's the RS chain here, what can you see? And I'll bring another tooth up because I filed that one. Have a look at that tooth there. It's a little bit different than Hexa, isn't it? I'll just grab another one just for... You can see a very, very little tiny point there. Now, the other thing that I want to pay your attention to is when you see... We'll just flip that over. Hang on, I just want to check something here. Let's see if I get a better picture of it. Okay, just see if I can see on that one there. What I want to show you is that the Hexa comes right down on the inside, just below, when you look at the thickness of the top plate, the Hexa comes right down here. Whereas you can see that little C shape a lot better. So if we put the Hexa, the inside of the Hexa, you'll see the difference if we compare the both of them. There, you can clearly see that. We'll put the two of them up. So you can clearly see the Hexa that goes in and goes down on that angle, whereas you can see that C shape on the RS. It's easy to see. Now, if we look in the top left-hand corner again, you can see I've got a picture of the inside of a Hexa from the patent. And you'll see how that straight section works. Now, if you look at, and we'll just sort of move the camera a little bit, if you were to look at the Hexa and you look at the RS, they're well, I can't see any difference on the underside of the actual tooth. They look the same, the underside here and the underside here. These are the same. I've measured everything up, and as I said, the top plate angle with the slope is 12 degrees. The height's almost identical. The actual height of the tooth is the same. It's only a little bit difference in the gullet. The RS has got a slightly little deeper gullet, slightly. But it's interesting when you look at the geometry, and the conclusion is that Stihl Hexa does work 10% better than full chisel. And I would say that 5% is probably because of the narrow kerf, maybe even slightly more. And it could be also because of this angle that you can see here that goes down is much better at cutting efficiency than the typical C shape, which looks like that. And that's about it. So if you're wondering about the Hexa, that's the best information that I've sort of come across as to why it works better. And I use it in softwood and I also use it in hardwood, but I don't like to use it in hardwood that's been laying around for 3 or 4 years, because definitely the point of the Hexa will go blunter than semi-chisel if you're using it in extremely hard wood, and we do have the hardest wood in the world here. I'm cutting grey box. That's about 15 kilonewtons on the Janka scale. The hardest wood in the world is what we've got, which is called bull oak. That's 16.7 on the Janka scale. So we've got some really hard wood, and full chisel will certainly go blunter if it's around 15 or around 15 on the Janka scale. Certainly your green timber in your hardwood is a lot easier to cut and much more forgiving. But still also state that because of the geometry and the way that it cuts into timber more efficient, that the actual chain stays sharper longer. Now, I don't know, I haven't done any laboratory tests or anything else like that, but I'm not really worried about it. I like the performance of Hexa. I highly recommend it as the best cut-in chain so far that I've used. You've also got its competition called X-Cut in Husqvarna. And Husqvarna's been around longer than, the X-Cut has been around longer than the Hexa. So that's my take on it. It's got my thumbs up. Okay, so I want to just briefly recap. We look up in the top left-hand corner. This little statement made by Stihl is suggesting that Hexa has got bigger cutting teeth. Must be a misprint, because when I've measured, there is virtually no difference. In actual fact, Hexa is smaller. And what I mean by that is that if we're to look at the actual kerf of the tooth, Hexa, the widest point of the tooth when looking down on the top plate, is 4.1 millimeters in width. On the one on the top, which is Stihl RS, that's 4.5 millimeters in width. When I used the digital vernier caliper and we measured the tooth depth from the highest point of the tooth to the gullet, on the Hexa it was 4.5 millimeters in depth, and on the RS chain it was 5 millimeters in depth. The only thing that looked a little bit bigger was the length of the tooth was slightly longer. We had an average of about 9.95 millimeters in length on the RS, and we had an average length of around about 10.05 millimeters in length on the Hexa. The only other part that's bigger, if you want to call it that, is the actual tooth point. Now, that's the top plate cutting angle. And as seen on here, you can see how that angle extends almost the full width of the side plate, about 80% before it reaches the bottom of the side plate, then it curves down. That's about the only part that's bigger when they say that the teeth are bigger. But overall, the dimensions of the tooth is not bigger. It's actually slightly smaller, especially in the kerf, 10% narrower. So where that claim comes from, I don't know. Anyway, nonetheless, only one other final point to mention, that a lot of people complain about the Hexa files. They're expensive and they don't last long. I can understand that complaint. That's a fairly legitimate complaint. Personally, what I do is that I don't use Hexa files anyway. I do them on the electric grinder. So if you've got an electric grinder, all you've got to do is profile another 30 degrees from 90 degrees. So if you were to have your grinding wheel sitting vertical and you ran the grinding block across, that would be 90 degrees. But if you hold the grinding block at another 30 degrees, that would be a span of 120 degrees. And that span of 120 degrees is exactly what you see here on the Hexa. That's a span of 120 degrees. So, with all the information that's out there on Hexa, the patents out there, the reason that Hexa would cut as good as what it does is because it's got a narrow kerf. That certainly helps. Then you could turn around and say, why don't all teeth have a narrower kerf? Well, that's a good question too, isn't it? If it certainly works for Hexa with a narrower kerf, why don't we just make 3/8 chain with a narrower kerf? Because they've already got it on Husqvarna's X-Cut. Very interesting question. But I think it's a combination of this 60-degree angle on the side plate that comes down, the top plate cutting angle, which also extends to the side plate because it doesn't change in shape. And it is this angle here that you can see that gives its cutting ability, that it's much easier to pierce the timber. Less friction because of the narrower kerf, and because of that angle, it does its job much easier than the C-shape. As I mentioned earlier before about different shapes. So certainly with a worldwide patent, Hexa is definitely beats standard full chisel. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.